This is my family farm, but it's drowning in debt. For the entire next year, we'll have to work hard, managing the fields, taking care of the animals, and even building our own road to the farm, all to save it from financial ruin. If you're interested, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Arriving in town, I first stopped at the gas station to fill up the tank, then headed to my grandfather's farm. He had been managing it his whole life. As a child, I often visited him, so I still remembered some of the roads and places in this town. My grandfather lived near a small forest, and the road to his house was in poor condition. When I pulled into the yard, I saw him already waiting for me near the house. We talked for a bit, and I learned that the farm was deep in debt. My grandfather had called me to help pay it off. Since I loved my grandfather very much, I was more than happy to help him. The first thing he asked me to do was feed the cows, as their feeders were empty. He explained where everything was and how to prepare their feed. All the necessary equipment for the job was in the large red shed next to the barn. To make the feed, I would need silage stored in the silage pits across from the barn. Silage was essential for preparing a total mixed ration to feed the cows. Additionally, I needed grass and straw, which were stored in a small barn across from our house. First, I headed to the barn to check on the cows. Just as my grandfather had said, the feeders were completely empty. That meant the first task was to find the tractor. I went to the shed and opened the doors. Inside, there was a lot of equipment, including the tractor I needed. I also needed a mixer, which was parked next to the trailer. So I got into the tractor, attached the mixer, and drove to the silage pit to load the silage. However, I also needed a loader for this. Remembering that I had seen one in the shed, I ran back to get it. Then I drove to the silage pit. Before loading, I removed the tarp covering the silage and filled up the loader's bucket. I was about to dump it into the mixer when I remembered that preparing total mixed ration required the correct proportions. So I detached the bucket and went to get the straw and hay to gradually add each ingredient and get the mixture just right. Grandfather had told me that the straw and hay were stored in bales, so I needed forks, which were kept under the shed with the equipment. After grabbing them, I headed to the storage area, but our pickup truck was blocking the way. I had to move it first. I'd have to ask my grandfather later where the best place to park it was so it wouldn't get in the way. Then I got into the loader and started loading the boils. I took a hay bale first, since it was right by the entrance, and brought it to the mixer. I added just under half of it. This seemed like enough for the first time. Next, I needed straw, but it was stacked against the wall and blocked by other hay bales. I had to move a few of them manually, which wasn't easy because they were quite heavy. Once I had cleared the way, I speared the nearest straw bale with the forks and took it to the mixer. Less straw was needed compared to hay. After that, I reattached the bucket, loaded it with silage, and poured it into the mixer. The bucket fit perfectly, and the mixture was ready. Then I returned the bucket to its place and put the forks with the remaining bales back in the storage area. Now I could get into the tractor and unload the prepared total mixed ration into the feeders. The feed filled less than half of the feeders, but I figured it would be enough for today. Since we didn't need the mixer anymore, I returned it to its place. With that, I could say we had completed my grandfather's first task. The cows were happily eating the total mixed ration. Now, it was time to check with my grandfather to see if he had any more work for me. He said that there was nothing urgent at the moment, so I asked him where I could park my pickup truck. My grandfather told me that there was a small shelter next to the storage area for straw and hay that could be used as a garage. However, it hadn't been used in a long time, and the entrance was overgrown with weeds. Before parking my truck there, I needed to clear the area. Without hesitation, I got to work. In my grandfather's shed, I had seen a mower that could quickly cut down all the grass in front of the future garage. I got into the tractor, attached the mower, and drove to the shelter. However, since the mower was too bulky for tight spaces, I could only clear a small area in front of the entrance. Still, I figured it was enough. Now, I just needed to remove the cut grass. I decided to ask my grandfather where I could find a shovel and what to do with the grass. He told me there was a shovel behind the house and that I should dump the grass in the cow feeders. I grabbed the shovel and went to where the cut grass was lying. At first, I thought about using the trailer, but it was too big and hauling such a small pile in it didn't make sense. So I decided to use the loader instead, as the shovel made it easy to load the grass directly into the bucket. The bucket was big enough to collect everything in one go. Then I drove to the cows and unloaded the grass into their feeder, just as my grandfather had instructed. Judging by their reaction, the cows seemed happy with the fresh greenery. With all the work for the day done, I put all the equipment back in its place. Then I got into the pickup and parked it in the new garage. That marked the end of the day's tasks, and I could finally rest. Waking up in the morning, I immediately talked to my grandfather about the upcoming work. The first task was to check on our cows, as their feeders were nearly empty. Once again, I needed to prepare a total mixed ration, but this time, I decided to make a larger batch to ensure the cows had enough feed until the next month. Since I already knew the correct proportions, I started with the silage. After filling the loader's bucket, I suddenly realized that I had forgotten to turn on the mixer. Fixing that mistake, I poured the silage into the mixer and then went to get the hay and straw. I added all the ingredients in the right proportions, and I decided to spread the leftover hay as bedding for the cows. In the end, we had a full trailer of total mixed ration, so I went to fill the feeders. The feeder ended up being filled to almost half, but I noticed there still wasn't enough straw, so I threw another bale into the pen. Now the cows had everything they needed. After that, I went back to my grandfather to ask what needed to be done next. He told me that a new crop of grass had grown and was ready to be harvested. However, our silage pits were completely full, so we needed to clear some space first. I suggested to my grandfather that we sell the silage from one of the pits and then mow the grass and store it in the freed up space. The remaining grass could be baled. This way, we would not only earn money from selling the silage, but also gather a fresh harvest. My grandfather liked the idea, and I immediately set out to put it into action. First, I attached the trailer to the tractor and positioned it next to the silage pit to make loading easier with the loader. Then I began loading the silage. After filling the first trailer, I was about to take it for sale when I suddenly realized that I had forgotten to ask where exactly to deliver it. I quickly ran to my grandfather, who told me that he sold all his harvest at the farmer's market. Now everything was clear, so I returned to the tractor and headed to the store to sell the first trailer of silage. Upon arriving at the market, I sold the full trailer of silage and earned just over $9,000. The entire amount was immediately used to pay off part of the loan. However, we still had plenty of silage left, so I returned to the farm to load another batch. After filling another trailer, I set off for another sale and earned the same amount as before. But there was still a bit of silage left in the pit, so we would continue making a profit. Returning to the farm, I loaded the remaining silage. It nearly filled another trailer, which I took to sell once more. This time, we earned just over $7,000, which was still a decent sum. In the end, we managed to pay off almost a third of the loan, which was an excellent result. Returning home, I decided to check on our cows. I noticed that a fair amount of manure had accumulated, so I decided to clean it up. For this, I got into the loader with the bucket and collected all the manure. Then I went to unload it into the manure pit, which was located near the barns. After that, I could continue working with the silage. Now that the silage pit was completely empty, it was time to refill it. But before we could begin compacting and covering it, we needed to mow fresh grass. I got into the tractor, attached the mower, and headed to the field where the cutting would take place. This task took up most of the day, and by the time I was finishing, a light rain had started. That was a sign that it was time to wrap things up. As soon as I finished, I parked all the equipment in its place so it wouldn't be left out in the rain. Now I could finally relax after a busy day. The morning of the new month started like the previous ones, with a check on the cowshed. There was almost no feed left in the feeders, so I had to prepare another batch of total mixed ration. I gathered all the necessary equipment, removed the tarp from the second silage pit, which we still had left, and began mixing the feed. However, the straw bales we had previously retrieved were already used up, so I needed to get a few more. For this, I got into the loader and started rearranging the stacked hay bales to access the straw. It wasn't easy because there was little room to maneuver. Despite the challenges, I managed to get the job done. I retrieved several straw bales and continued preparing the feed. Once the total mixed ration was ready, I loaded it into the feeders and headed to work in the field. Now, I needed to completely fill the empty silage pit with freshly cut grass. To do this, I attached the forage trailer, which was parked in the corner of the shed. After hooking it up, I set off to collect the grass. I managed to gather several trailer loads, but I realized I needed to increase the density of the loading to fit more forage into the pit. So, I attached a special silage blade to the tractor and started pushing the forage to the far edge of the silage pit. At the same time, I created a small ramp to allow for easier dumping of new forage onto the already unloaded pile. Since there was still some forage left in the trailer, I decided to test our setup. Everything worked perfectly, so I continued gathering grass. I repeated this process until the silage pit was completely full. Then I leveled out the forage a bit to ensure an even distribution. Now, the only thing left was to compact it. For this, I attached a special roller to the tractor and got to work. At first, the freshly gathered grass made the tractor slip slightly, but after a few minutes of compacting, the surface became firmer, making movement easier. Soon, the forage was fully prepared for fermentation. Now, it was time to bale the remaining grass. But first, it needed proper preparation. The grass had to be spread out and dried, so it would turn into hay faster. I attached a tedder and headed to the field to start the process. The work progressed quickly, and within an hour, I had finished tedding the hay. Now, it needed to be raked into neat windrows to make baling easier. I went to get the necessary equipment, then returned to the field and got to work. The day was coming to an end, and I managed to finish raking all the hay just in time. With this part of the job done, I could finally rest. But before that, I needed to put all the equipment back in place. I also remembered that I had forgotten to cover the forage in the silage pit, so I hurried to fix that mistake. Afterward, I had a brief chat with my grandfather about the day's work and then went to rest. Waking up in the morning, I looked out the window and saw heavy rain. It was immediately clear that working in the fields would be impossible today. However, I didn't want to just sit at home, so I went to my grandfather to ask what I could do. He told me that despite the rain, the cows still needed to be fed, since they would be hungry no matter the weather. In a way, this was actually a good thing, as it gave me something to do. I went to the barn, and as expected, found that the feeders were empty. So, I immediately started preparing the equipment to mix a new batch of total mixed ration. Since I had done this many times before, the entire process went smoothly, and in less than an hour, the feed was ready. I began unloading it into the feeders. Once all the cows were fed, I returned the mixer to its place and thought about what else I could do. Then I remembered that since arriving at the farm, I hadn't sold any milk yet. Most likely, there was already enough stored afford to take to market. Before making any decisions, I checked with my grandfather. As I suspected, he agreed with my idea and also reminded me that the milk tanker was stored in the garage next to the barn. Wasting no time, I ran to the tractor to bring it over to the tanker. After that, I attached the tanker to the old tractor, closed the barn doors, and drove to the milk loading station. There were already a little over 11,500 litres of milk stored in the barn, so I immediately started filling the tanker. It filled up completely, but there were still a few thousand litres left in storage, which was definitely good news. Remembering my previous mistake, I quickly went to my grandfather to confirm where I needed to deliver the milk. He told me that he always sold it to the dairy factory near Highway 97. They offered a good price, so he consistently worked with that processing plant. With the necessary information, I set off. Reaching the railroad crossing, I spotted the factory building and drove straight to the unloading area. After the milk was delivered, we earned just under $18,000. This was an excellent result since we were now able to pay off another third of the debt. Feeling good, I headed back home. Upon returning to the farm, I parked the tanker in its place. By that time, the rain had stopped, so I decided to check if the grass in the field had dried. Running to one of the windrows, I saw that it was completely dry, which meant it was time to start baling. I quickly returned to the farm and began preparing the equipment. Since the baler was stored in the farthest corner of the shed, I first had to clear the way to get it out. However, the mower and tedder were blocking access, so I needed to move them first. I got into the tractor, relocated the equipment behind the silage pit, and only then was I able to retrieve the baler. Now I could begin baling the hay. The work progressed slowly, but I managed to produce quite a lot of bales. By the time I was finished, I had gathered 35 bales from the entire field, which was a very good result. Now we needed to collect the bales. In my grandfather's shed, I saw a trailer with an automatic bale loader. However, I needed to figure out where to store them. I quickly ran to my grandfather to ask where I should take them. He pointed to a large barn that was barely used, saying we could stack the bales there. I got into the tractor, attached the trailer, and headed to the field to start collecting them. The trailer could hold only 14 bales at a time, so I would have to make multiple trips. Once the trailer was full, I drove to the barn my grandfather had mentioned. I opened the barn doors and carefully positioned the trailer in a designated spot to unload the collected bales. After stacking them in the right corner, I went back for the next batch. The second load was placed right next to the first. However, there were still a few bales left in the field that needed to be picked up. Since we had already stored a significant amount, I decided to sell the remaining bales and use the money to pay off part of the loan. But I had to hurry because the weather forecast predicted rain soon. I immediately drove to the store, and when I arrived, I sold the bales, earning just over $8,000, which went straight toward repaying the debt. On the way home, I thought about how the trip to town took too much time and decided that we needed to find a shorter route. When I returned, I discussed this with my grandfather. He told me that he had already thought about it and had planned to build a road through the forest. He had even bought the necessary equipment and started working on it, but never finished. I offered to complete the construction, and he agreed. The first step would be clearing the road of trees. There was a wood chipper in storage that we could use to process the logs into wood chips, and then sell them to earn money to pay off part of the loan. I drove the tractor to pick up the wood chipper. When I opened the storage doors and inspected the equipment, I noticed a chainsaw sitting on top, which we would also need. I hooked up the wood chipper and brought it to the starting point of the future road. Then I positioned the trailer nearby so the wood chips would be loaded directly into it. With everything set up, I connected the chipper to the tractor and started it up. The only thing left was to cut down the trees, saw them into pieces, and manually load them for processing. I began clearing the road, and after making some progress, it started raining. Since the rain made the work more difficult, I decided to call it a day. I parked all the equipment back in its place and went to rest so I could continue the job the next day. The next day, before continuing work on the road, I decided to sell the accumulated wood chips. Since the trailer was nearly full, I hooked it up and headed to the selling point. For this almost full trailer, we earned just under $19,000, which was great news. This meant that we could pay off a significant portion of the debt just by selling wood chips. After emptying the trailer, I returned to continue working on the road. Our task now was simply to cut down trees, process them into wood chips, and transport them for sale. Step by step, we cleared the area, gradually moving the equipment further along the path. Even when it started raining, I kept working, determined to complete the road as quickly as possible. Then I noticed that the tractor was running low on diesel, so I needed to ask my grandfather if we had any fuel for refueling. He told me that he had recently brought a barrel of diesel and stored it in the barn where we kept the bales. So I drove the tractor to the barn, found the barrel, and refueled it. However, the barrel only provided enough fuel to fill half the tank, but I figured that would last for quite a while. After that, I continued working. As the rain started to get heavier, I decided to stop for the day. The heavy downpour continued for several months, making it impossible to return to road construction. It wasn't until November that the rain finally stopped. Early in the morning, I resumed work on building the road. I believed that we were close to finishing, as there weren't many trees left to clear. By noon, I could already see our town in the distance, but there was one last tree left to cut down. I finished the job at 12 o'clock and took a look around. All the trees along our future road had been cleared. This was great news, because the hardest part of the job was finally done. Since there were still wood chips left in the trailer, they needed to be sold. Now, thanks to the new road, I no longer had to take a long detour through the forest and fields. I could head straight to the store, making the process much faster. After selling the trailer of wood chips, our remaining debt was just over $12,000. This was excellent news, because now we could completely pay off the debt just by selling milk. After that, I put all the unnecessary equipment back in its place. Then I ran to my grandfather to ask what we could use to cover the road to prevent trees from growing back. He said he would think about it and let me know later. In the meantime, I decided to take the mower and clear out the large weeds and grass along our new road. After attaching it to the tractor, I started mowing the path leading to town. Once the job was done, I headed back home to get the forage trailer so I could collect the cut grass. After hooking it up, I returned to the road and gathered all the grass, deciding to give it to the cows so it wouldn't go to waste. When I unloaded the feed, I noticed that the cows had run out of total mixed ration. So, after collecting all the grass from the road, I prepared a new batch of feed. At the same time, I cleaned out the manure that had accumulated over this period. With all the tasks finally completed, I could finally rest, as the day was coming to an end. As I was about to enter the house, my grandfather stopped me and told me that he had found a place where we could get gravel to cover the road. A good friend of his lived near town and owned a small quarry where we could collect the necessary amount of gravel. I was thrilled by the news and went to bed in a good mood, knowing that tomorrow would be a busy day. The next morning, I started the tractor, hooked up the trailer, and headed to the quarry for gravel. However, we needed additional transport for loading, so my grandfather followed behind me with the loader. As I approached the site, I noticed a large puddle at the entrance, which made me a little uneasy, but I hoped our tractor could handle it without any issues. Upon arrival, I waited for my grandfather. As soon as he pulled up, I switched to the loader and started loading the trailer. Due to the weight of the gravel, the work was not easy, but eventually we managed to get it done. Once the trailer was fully loaded, I got back into the tractor and set off for the farm. The trailer contained 25,000 litres of gravel, which was quite a heavy load for our tractor. Going downhill, I had to brake frequently because even at a low speed, the tractor started accelerating. Fortunately, it handled the weight well, and after passing the most dangerous section, I breathed a sigh of relief and continued my journey to the farm without any issues. Upon arrival, I immediately began spreading the gravel along the entire road. Once that was done, I returned to the farm, where my grandfather was already waiting. Now I had to gather the necessary equipment to level the gravel. After collecting the required tools, I got to work, gradually smoothing out the piles. Bit by bit, the road became even, and by sunset, it was completely finished. Now, we had a convenient shortcut from the farm to town, which would significantly speed up and simplify our work. The only thing left to do was pay off the remaining debt, and then my job on the farm would be complete. But I decided to take care of that the next day. For now, I needed to put all the equipment back in place and finally get some rest. The next morning, I got into the tractor, attached the milk tanker, and filled it with milk produced by our cows. Thanks to the recently built road, I could now quickly reach the selling point. After selling the milk, we were able to completely pay off the loan and even make a small profit, just over $4,000. When I returned home, my grandfather told me that I could take the day off since I had already helped him so much. But that wasn't the end of it, because that night I heard a loud explosion. I immediately set out to check the area since it wasn't far from us. Leaving my vehicle nearby, I hurried closer to get a better look, and there, right in front of me, was a UFO. Suddenly, I felt myself lifting off the ground, and while they're taking me away, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you next time.